A long, long time ago, way back in the days of King Arthur, there lived a young knight who attacked and raped a young maiden in the forest one day. He was captured the very next day by the king's guards and brought to stand trial before the king himself. After a short while, the king came up with his verdict. The young man was to hang the very next day. But then something happened that the knight did not expect, for the queen intervened on his behalf. She argued that as his crime had been against a woman, so it be that his fate should be decided by a woman. The king decided to indulge Guinevere, and he agreed that she should decide what was to become of the young man. The knight, very relieved, was intent to hear what the queen had in store for him. "Well," she said, "if you can return here within 1 year with the answer to my question, then you shall go free. If not, you shall be executed 1 year from now. And my question is this: what is it that women most desire?" The knight was delighted to be given a reprieve, but also very worried that he wouldn't be able to come up with the answer to this question, for he had frankly no idea at this point in time. Nonetheless, he was confident he could return within a year with the answer. So he rode away from the castle, and as he did so, the queen's words rang in his ears. "What is it that women most desire? Take care, and keep thy neckbone from iron." Well, the knight travelled up and down the country. He travelled everywhere he could think of. He travelled north, south, east, west, up, down, left, right, every corner of the kingdom he covered in his search for the answer to this question. But never did he find anywhere where he'd get the same answer twice from two women. In some places he'd go, they'd say that what women most wanted was power. In another, that women most wanted riches. Another woman might say that she wanted a man who was good in bed. Or another still, that the finest clothes were what she desired most. But he couldn't find two creatures that agreed with the same idea. So on he searched, and the days drew on, and eventually there was only 1 day to go before he had to present himself once again in front of the Queen. Now at this point, I'd just like to tell you a little bit about the knight's early history of himself. Perhaps we can get an insight into why he behaved so wrongly towards the women. Well, he was born into a very poor family. His father died at the age of 4, but when he was the age of 4 at least, that is. And his mother, his poor mother, who had 16 children, had to bring them all up, all by herself. Now, this very quickly became far too much for the poor old woman. And eventually she'd come home every night drunk on mead. She'd give him a belt around the ears. She'd whack him. She'd do anything, you know. Eventually it just became too much. And this tiny house, they're living in a tiny house, and there's 20 of them. One mother coming home every night, drunk on mead, whacking him away, belting him. He used to cry himself to sleep every night. And his brothers and sisters weren't any help either. They all learned how to get by, all in isolation of each other. They had to try and find their own little space in this tiny little house of 20 people. And all the while getting belted by this old drunken mother of theirs. Well, I don't need you to tell it. you don't need me to tell you that by the time you reached the age of 16, he was up and out of there as quick as he could. And in the back of his mind, he always had this fear and loathing for women. And I think that there's a certain amount of we can draw from that. But back to the tale. The young man, one day left to go, and well, he still didn't know the answer to the question. So what was he going to do? Well, as he was walking through the woods, in fact, those very same woods that he'd been in when he'd raped the young woman in the first place. And as he walked through these woods, he saw in front of him, dancing, a whole group of women, a group of young women dancing around gaily and freely. And he thought possibly this was the final stage. This is where he could get his answer. Maybe he could get an agreement, finally, an accord between at least two of these people. But unfortunately, as soon as he got anywhere near the group, they all vanished into the forest as if they'd never been there in the first place. Well, he was dismayed, but as he drew nearer, he noticed that actually they hadn't all gone, because there was one old woman sitting there on her own in the forest, under the tree. Now, unlike these other women who'd been there before, who were delightful, beautiful creatures, this was an old hag. In fact, she was the vilest, most disgusting looking woman he'd ever seen in his life. Well, nonetheless, he was tired and he had no other options, so he went and sat down next to her. Before he could speak, she started speaking to him. She said to him, "Young man, I know what it is that you want. I know what it is that you need. You need the answer to the Queen's riddle." The knight was amazed at this. How could this old hag possibly know what he wanted? And yet she did. She said to him, "I can spare you your life, young man. I can give you the answer to the Queen's question. And I can guarantee that she will agree with me." Well, of course, he was intrigued. He was desperate, in fact, to know the answer she had. But she made him promise that if he was to be told the answer, he in turn would have to make a commitment to do the next thing that she asked of him. And she bent forward and she whispered in his ear her request. The next day arrived in the court, and all the court's finest were turned out to hear the result, to hear what this young man, after his year of searching, had come up with as the answer to the riddle. And as he entered the room, a huge fanfare sang out. Carpets were laid down, there were jugglers, entertainers, everything. But as he walked along, a hush fell over the room until you could have heard a pinprick, and then his footsteps as he approached the King and the Queen themselves. "Well," the Queen said, "do you have the answer to my question?" "Yes, I do," said the knight. "What women most desire is to have power and mastery over the men in their lives." Again, silence around the room. But then, gradually, a murmuring picked up, and as you looked around the room, you would have seen all the women in the room talking to each other, giggling, nodding, and agreeing. The Queen smiled. "Young man, you have answered me correctly. Yes, what women most want is the power over the men in their lives. And for this answer, you may go free this day, on the condition that you must never again attack a woman in this fashion." The knight sighed a huge sigh of relief and was ready to leave the room when suddenly, in the corner, an old cackling voice came out. "Wait a minute," she said, for it was the old hag from the day before. "This young man has made me a promise. He's promised to marry me this very day, for it is I that gave him the answer that you just heard." The Queen looked at the knight and asked him, "Is this true?" "Well, yes," he said. "But, old woman, is there nothing else that I can do? Anything, you choose it, money?" But she was adamant. She was determined to be married to him that very day. Well, they married that afternoon in front of the King and Queen themselves. And that night they retired to the knight's house. But he wasn't feeling too frisky that night, and the old hag found it very difficult to capture his attention. He had his back turned to her in bed. "Why do you ignore me, my young husband?" she said. "What's wrong?" "Well, what do you think's wrong?" he said. "I mean, look at you, you're a disgusting old hag, you're poor, of poor birth, no money, ugly, old. What is there to like?" "Well," she said, "let's look at the things you just said in turn, shall we? You say that I'm ugly. Well, there's no sin in being ugly, and after all, if you think about it, the fact that I'm ugly means that there's no other man in town that would fancy me, so you're assured of not being cuckolded. You say that I'm of poor birth. Well, Jesus Christ himself was of poor birth. You don't get born with nobility.